They buried a hero in Brook Hollow, certain he was gone. The uniform was folded, the casket sealed, the final salute delivered. But one voice refused silence. A single bark shattered the stillness, louder than grief, sharper than doubt. It rose again, wilder, more urgent, until they had no choice but to open the casket. What they saw inside silenced the crowd and rewrote everything they thought they knew about that night. This is the true story of a bond that defied death, and the dog who uncovered the truth before anyone else. Brook Hollow sat in the shadow of the Rockies, a quiet town wrapped in early frost and routines that rarely wandered. That particular morning, the air was brittle and sharp, the kind that made each breath curl into pale ghosts before vanishing. Low clouds clung to the rooftops, promising snow but delivering only stillness, the sky holding its breath. Officer Jake Rourke drove toward the outskirts in a tactical van, his jaw set, his pulse steady with the calm only years of service could teach. 38, broad-shouldered, dark-haired with threads of gray creeping through, the kind of man whose eyes, a weathered blue, held too much and said very little. Before the badge, he'd served a decade in the Marines. That life left behind more than scars. It etched discipline into bone and grief into silence. This morning, he wore his uniform like armor, and with it, bore the weight of command not just over men, but over one loyal shadow. Axel. Axel, 5 years old, was a German shepherd, built like a bullet-dense muscle, amber eyes sharp with intention. He moved with the wary precision of something forged in war, a creature molded by loyalty and loss. A pale scar ran along his left hind leg, the mark of a partner he hadn't survived. Since then, Axel had been difficult, distrustful. He had growled at every outstretched hand until Jake. What the man offered wasn't affection, but patience, and it was enough. Over time, Axel had begun to rest fully when Jake was near, to breathe. Now they moved as one, instincts coiled and ready, twin parts of a machine built for response. The van rolled to a stop beside a crumbling warehouse, once a paper mill, now nothing more than a rusted carcass. The mission was supposed to be clean, a drug bust, a quick sweep. Instead, it was an ambush. Gunfire burst like glass. Who fired first, no one knew, only that within seconds 2 officers were down, one collapsed against the stairwell, another crawling through blood. Jake took a bullet to the abdomen, but stayed upright long enough to drag a partner back behind broken concrete. Somewhere in the crossfire, Axel lunged through shadows and splintered beams, tearing down a suspect with merciless precision. But even the best-trained canines can't stop everything. Smoke clawed at the rafters, shouts bled into static, then quiet. When the medics arrived, they found 2 officers crumpled side by side near the southwest wall. Snow had begun to fall. Light, indifferent. One had no pulse. The other, barely breathing, bore no ID. Both wore matching uniforms, torn, bloodied, indistinguishable. The deceased wore a tactical coat stitched with J. Rourke at the cuff. In the chest pocket, Jake's badge, his wallet, and an old photo. All of them Jake's. No one asked further questions. No one looked closer. The name sewn on the sleeve, along with the belongings in the pocket, were enough to declare the man as Jake Rourke. 3 days later, Evergreen Cemetery held the town still. The sky wore a dull pewter hue, and the wind sliced clean through wool and prayer. The crowd was modest, but weighted uniformed shoulders, neighbors in silence, a pastor with a voice rubbed raw from years of eulogies. Jake's mother, Eleanor Rourke, stood at the front, tall and slightly stooped, her gloved hands clenching a white handkerchief. In her late 60s, she was carved from long-endured duty, a woman who had weathered more absences than homecomings. Her face bore the patient resolve of someone who never asked for pity-only truth. She stared at the casket draped in the flag with a silence that was neither disbelief nor acceptance. Just breath, shallow and cold. Nora Bell stood beside her, her posture upright and calm. A trauma physician in her early 40s, she wore her dark auburn hair pinned back in a tight, no-nonsense knot. Her eyes were steady. She was not Jake's lover, nor his confidant. They had only stood together in urgent scenes, those brief, unsparing moments where closeness wasn't required to be unforgettable. As the service began, Nora stood in stillness, her gaze unreadable. At one point, she looked toward the casket, then toward the dog. But that was all. No words, no suspicion, just a look between two breaths. Axel had been allowed to attend, a rare exception. Muzzled, leashed, yet barely contained. He sat rigid by the grave, ears flicking with the rhythm of the prayer, his breath curling into mist. At first he didn't move, then the wind turned, and he sprang to his feet. What followed wasn't sound, it was rupture. A low growl swelled into a bark, sharp as a blade tearing through the hymn. Heads turned. Axel barked again, louder now, fiercer, as if in revolt against every word, every note. He yanked at the leash, body taut and trembling, locked in absolute refusal. No command soothed him. No voice reached him. The service faltered. Whispers scattered like startled birds. The pastor froze. Eleanor's knuckles turned white, and in the hush that followed, after the last bark shattered the silence. Nora felt it. Something vague had brushed her, as though a voice had called her name without sound. Not clear, not explainable, but real, and impossible to ignore. She stepped forward, not hesitating, not rushing. Her hand found Axel's leash, not to restrain, but to feel. Her breath turned to frost as she looked again at the casket. And in that moment, the thing without a name began to take shape. The ceremony lingered in a hush long after the last echo of barking had vanished into the trees. Snow had begun to fall in the gentlest way, like it was trying not to interrupt. The mourners shifted uncertainly, whispering among themselves, their boots crunching against frozen grass. Some looked at Axel. Others avoided him entirely. Axel remained unmoving now, standing beside the casket, shoulders squared, breath steady. A sentinel. Eleanor Rourke hadn't moved either. Her eyes, weathered from years of watching suns go off and not return, were narrowed not in grief now, but in something closer to suspicion. Beside her, Nora Bell still held the leash. She hadn't let go. Her stance was calm, but inside her, a ripple was spreading. That barking, it hadn't been grief, not the animal kind. It had been something sharper, a protest, perhaps even recognition. Her gaze flicked again to the casket, then to Axel, who was no longer straining. He stood in eerie stillness, as though the thing that had demanded his voice had now retreated. But it wasn't peace, it was a waiting. A few yards behind the crowd, Martin Cates stood with gloved hands buried deep in his coat pockets. He was tall, quiet, and typically blended into the edges of any scene. A forensic technician for the precinct, Martin had arrived early and stayed back deliberately, watching the procession unfold from beneath the skeletal shade of a barren sycamore. He hadn't spoken to anyone, not yet. But his eyes were sharp, cataloging details even grief tried to ignore. Sheriff Lucas Dent broke the silence. A man in his mid-50s with broad shoulders and a narrow tolerance for ambiguity, he had the face of someone carved slowly by too many funerals. His uniform was sharp, the collar stiff, but the weariness in his voice softened what might have been command into something more human. "Let's give the dog a moment," he said. The crowd shifted again, unsure whether this was a delay or something far stranger. Nora turned toward him. A quiet glance exchanged. Words weren't needed. Something passed between them. Acknowledgement, maybe a shared discomfort neither wanted to voice. Nearby, Eleanor stood stone still, her eyes not leaving the casket. Not once. Then, without request or hesitation, her voice cut clean through the murmuring. "Open it." No questions followed. The clarity in her tone silenced them all. A funeral director, Daniel Ward, thin, balding, precise, hesitated briefly, then nodded to the attendants. The younger of the two, cheeks flushed from cold and nerves, fumbled with the latches. The other, broader and slower, moved like he'd done this many times and never liked it once. The lid lifted. Air pulled inward through the crowd, a collective breath held tight. The man inside was pale, lips drained of color, cheeks sunken. Ice crystals still clung to the brow and temples. But in the strained winter light, faint lines could still be read. Slopes of bone, shadows of scars. And Eleanor saw them all. She didn't gasp. She didn't scream. She simply stared, absorbing the face like a photograph under scrutiny. The crease above the eyebrow wasn't Jake's. The nose was sharper. The jaw sat too high. The stillness of recognition washed through her like wind over dry fields. "That's not my son," she said, not loud, but without a single thread of doubt. Axel, hearing her speak, settled into the snow, his body lowering as if released from duty. Not submission completion. Sheriff Lucas glanced sharply at the body, his mouth pressed into a hard line. No orders were given. There were none to give. The silence tightened. From beneath the sycamore, Martin Cates stepped forward. His presence wasn't dramatic, just timely, as though the moment had called him rather than the other way around. He stopped near the open grave, speaking not with certainty but with caution. "2 officers came in that night," he said, eyes on the casket. "One gone, one unconscious. No tags. Face wrapped. The wrong man was claimed." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. Nora looked at him now, the smallest nod exchanged between professionals who had both seen too many mistakes dressed as protocol. Her hand rested on Axel's leash, but her thoughts had moved elsewhere, toward the hospital, toward questions too urgent for burial. And somewhere in that graveyard, between snowflakes and truth, the shape of the real story began to take form. Brook Hollow, once dulled by routine, now held its breath in something colder than weather. The sky that morning was the color of old pewter, flat and unmoving. Snow no longer fell, but the frost lingered across rooftops and sidewalks like a question no one knew how to answer. The cemetery was quiet, save for the crunch of boots and the last flutter of ribbons abandoned by the wind. Word of what had happened of the opened casket, the wrong face inside, the dog that wouldn't stop barking spread not like gossip, but like a slow drip of doubt through stone. Sheriff Lucas Dent returned to the station with his jaw tighter than usual, his coat still lined with the scent of wet pine and gun oil. He didn't speak on the drive back. Beside him sat Deputy Aaron Clay, a lanky man in his early 30s with nervous fingers and a voice too soft for his badge. Clay had grown up in Brook Hollow, had known Jake since grade school, and was now processing the possibility that everything they'd buried might have been a mistake. He didn't ask the question sitting in his throat. Lucas wouldn't have answered anyway. The station, tucked behind a strip of diners and shuttered antique stores, felt colder than outside. Files were pulled. Logs reopened. Lucas requested hospital intake records from the night of the shootout. What came back was a scan of confusion. 2 officers admitted, 1 dead on arrival, 1 unconscious and unidentified, both soaked in blood and snow. The living man had been rushed to surgery and sent straight into a medically induced coma. His face had been wrapped in gauze, no visual ID, no visitors authorized. His hands were too damaged for prints, and the attending trauma team had been ordered to prioritize stabilization over identification. Later, the ER physician, Dr. Raymond Baer, had signed off on the presumed ID based solely on the items found with the deceased. At the same time, Nora Bell was not in the hospital. Not yet. She was in her home office, a converted attic with angled ceilings and a wall of paper-thin case notes pinned with color-coded tacks. The windows were slightly fogged, her breath still visible as she stood near the radiator. On her desk lay a stack of medical reports from the ER's trauma intake. Inconsistencies, missing witness signatures, timestamp errors. The body had been released for burial before the snow stopped falling. No family had signed any forms. No coroner had waited for clearance. Nora's hands hovered over a form signed only with a single initial. The signature was nearly illegible, RB, belonging to Dr. Bear, the night shift physician in charge when the patients arrived. Bear was known in nearby circles for his efficiency, not his thoroughness. A man with a wide chest, a narrowing temper, and the habit of completing his reports before the ink had time to dry. He had once told Nora that during winter storms, speed saved more lives than certainty. That logic had now left someone buried who didn't belong in the ground. She slid her notes aside and opened a separate logbook. Field transcripts from the rapid response unit that had extracted the injured men from the warehouse. Weather conditions severe. Visibility low. Communications unstable. The storm had hit just as extraction began. Power had flickered. Roads were blocked. Phones didn't ring. Eleanor Rourke had not been notified because no one could reach her. Among the notes was a single report by a field medic named Jules Moreno. She had been among the last to leave the site that night, a compact woman with fast reflexes and a sharper tongue. Her file described a key detail. She'd found 2 officers side by side, one clearly dead, the other barely breathing. Both wore identical uniforms, soaked in blood, but the dead one had a jacket with a name. She'd assumed the identity based on the coat. The body had also contained Jake's badge, a weathered leather wallet, and a photograph, an old one, curled at the edges, of Jake kneeling beside Axel. Nora closed her eyes and exhaled. But something didn't fit. Why was the other officer wearing Jake's jacket? In the chaos of the warehouse, many things could go wrong. Blood, snow, gear scattered, but swapping jackets? That wasn't normal. She made a note of it. Not as an answer, but as a question. Then she saw the photo again. The drawing. Jake's quiet smile beside Axel, the dog looking off-frame, ears perked toward something unseen. She remembered the silence between them, the way Jake once nodded after a failed resuscitation, not for comfort, but for solidarity. Back at the station, Lucas stared at the hospital's internal list again. The man in ICU had been labeled John Doe 27, alive, still in a coma, still under heavy monitoring, face unrevealed beneath gauze and swelling. No visitors allowed, per the hospital's emergency protocol. When Clay handed over the latest printout vitals stable, lungs clearing, Lucas rubbed his forehead. He said nothing, just grabbed his coat. They left without sirens. Meanwhile, Nora packed her bag in silence. No stethoscope, no gloves. Just a notebook, her badge, and the copy of the photo creased, stained, but unmistakable. She wasn't sure why she brought it. Only that something in the image still pulled at her. A memory, unfinished. She drove slow. Axel sat in the passenger seat, head low, eyes forward, as though he knew the route by instinct alone. The road to the hospital curved through a stretch of tall trees, their branches glazed in frost like veins against sky. Above them, the clouds had thinned just enough to allow light through, not sunlight, but something colder, more fragile. The kind of light that made everything seem both real and a little too still. Inside the ICU, beneath layers of white gauze and dim light, the man known as John Doe 27 remained unmoving. Machines traced his every breath. The nurse on duty, a middle-aged man named Tom, with a quiet voice and thinning hair, marked down vitals without looking up. And as their footsteps echoed toward the ICU door, Nora felt it, not fear, not relief, but the terrible gravity of truth coming up for air. The hospital loomed in a hush, the kind that pressed against the glass and settled into the seams of every hallway. Outside, the sky had turned the color of melting ash, neither night nor day, and the trees stood like still sentinels along the edge of the parking lot. In room 407, beneath the glow of muted monitors, the man they had called John Doe 27 began to move. Not much, just a shift of breath, a flutter beneath the eyelids, but it was enough. Down the hall, Eleanor Rourke hadn't left the hospital in 3 nights. She sat straight-backed in a wooden chair that had long since surrendered comfort, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on nothing. The years had taught her endurance, not expectation. She wore the same dark coat each day, a wool blend fraying at the cuffs, and her boots bore the salt lines of streets walked too long in winter. Axel lay curled at the ICU door, his body heavy with waiting. His golden brown eyes barely blinked, and every shallow breath from the room behind him sent a tremor through his flank. Occasionally his ears would twitch, or a soft whimper would escape him, not urgent, but low, like a memory echoing in his throat. His tail never moved. Stillness was his vigil. Inside, Jake stirred again, somewhere deep in the machinery of his mind. He heard the barking. It wasn't loud. It didn't startle. It threaded into him, as though it had always been there, quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. He dreamed in fragments. The first time he met Axel, the dog pacing inside the K9 unit's pen, shoulders tense, eyes wary. The first mission they were paired on. A search through heavy underbrush, blood on his hands, wind in his ears, and Axel nosing into the dark with a kind of furious grace. Another memory flickered snow, deep and soundless, pressing in from every side. He was down, bleeding, lungs stinging from cold. He had closed his eyes to let go, and then the bark. Not just sound, but summons. It had dragged him back toward breath. Now, in this place that smelled of antiseptic and machines, his fingers twitched. Axel's ears rose. Then came the breath. A full, clear draw of air. Jake's chest rose and fell again, slower this time, but deeper. His eyes cracked open, not fully, just enough for the world to blur back into place. Axel stood. The soft growl that rumbled in his chest was not a warning, but a call. Nora, standing nearby, straightened. She was still in her scrubs, coat draped over her arm, fatigue drawn in the fine lines beneath her eyes. She looked over at Eleanor, who had not moved, only lifted her gaze. Then came the knock of shoes on tile rapid, clipped. A nurse entered. Moments passed. A call was made. And finally, confirmation. The man they thought they had lost was awake. 3 days later, Jake was moved out of ICU and into a private recovery room near the far end of the corridor. The walls there were painted in soft, forgettable shades of green, the kind designed to fade into quiet. He lay propped slightly upright, color returning to his cheeks, though the shadows around his eyes remained like bruises of exhaustion. Eleanor sat beside him, quiet as always, a novel unopened in her lap. She no longer wept. She hadn't since the funeral. But something in her shoulders had loosened. Axel was curled beside her chair, nose on his paws, breathing slow. When Nora entered, she carried only a folder and a steady rhythm in her steps. Eleanor looked up, nodded once, and rose. She touched her son's shoulder briefly, then walked out, Axel falling into step beside her, without a word exchanged. Nora stood for a moment near the bed, uncertain whether to speak. Jake's eyes followed her movement without strain now, clearer, more present. The air between them held its own silence. She pulled a chair beside him and sat slowly, placing the file in her lap but not opening it. Then Jake turned slightly toward her, voice soft, but steady. "My mother told me," he said. She looked at him, waited, and finally asked the one question that hadn't let her go. Why had the other man been wearing Jake's coat? Jake didn't answer right away. His eyes narrowed, not in resistance, but in search. He moved through memory like fog, slow, soulful, and unfinished. Then gradually it returned. The other officer had been hit hard left chest, close to the heart. The bleeding was mad, terrifying. Jake had torn off his own coat, pressed it down tight to staunch the flow, then wrapped it around the man's torso to hold in what warmth he could. The cold had been brutal that night, seeping into the skin even through Kevlar. In those long, echoing minutes before help came, Jake believed he was doing the only thing he could. He hadn't thought that act of instinct would bury him in someone else's name. Nora said nothing. She didn't need to. Her eyes remained steady on his face, absorbing everything he didn't say aloud. The machines hummed. The snow outside had begun to fall again. Thin flakes, slow like ash after fire. Weeks passed before Jake Rourke could walk without help. His body mended slower than he liked, the ache of recovery not just in his muscles, but in his marrow. It was a quiet season hospital hallways, echoing more than they should, meals that arrived with steam but no taste, and nights that came too early, folding the world in gray. He spoke little, slept often, and in the spaces between, he remembered. On the day they finally cleared him for discharge, the doctor asked whether he wanted someone to escort him home. Press, escort, even family. Jake declined all of it. He needed quiet. He needed distance. He asked for a train ticket and left the rest behind. The train rolled into Brook Hollow just after dawn, its brakes sighing against the tracks like an old man settling into a familiar chair. Frost laced the platform, clinging to the edges of windows and stair railings, turning everything silver and still. The hills surrounding the town were touched with the faintest blue, washed in winter light. Jake stepped off without ceremony, his boots striking the planks with quiet weight. His gait was steady, but something about him had changed, slower in the shoulders, perhaps, or in the way his eyes searched not for danger, but for memory. He didn't need to ask who had died in his place. It had been Caleb. The scene replayed in pieces. The rush of footsteps on broken concrete, Caleb's voice crackling over the radio, the sharp bark of gunfire behind the crates. Jake had dropped beside him, hands pressing down on the wound blooming like a red blossom across his partner's chest. He had stripped off his coat, folded it tight against the wound, tucked Caleb's badge and wallet beneath it, alongside the photo he always carried of Axel, never expecting that act of desperation would mistake one life for another. Nobody had to tell him. Not Nora, not Eleanor. The moment he woke and saw the silence in his mother's eyes, the hesitation in Nora's breath, he knew. Caleb had fallen holding the line. Jake had only tried to keep him alive a few minutes longer. Axel waited at the edge of the station beneath the shadow of the town's only pine-lined platform, sitting tall, unmoving. The dog wore no leash now. His ears twitched as Jake approached, but he didn't rush. He simply stood, and when Jake crouched to meet him, Axel leaned into his chest, not in excitement, but recognition. A silent homecoming between two creatures who had passed through something no one else would understand. Eleanor stood nearby, wrapped in her charcoal coat, hands tucked beneath her sleeves. She had been the one to pick up Jake's coat from the hospital closet, the one to press the wrinkled photograph into his hand without speaking. Now she gave a short nod as mother and son passed, and this time she walked beside him. Jake's house still stood at the edge of town where the hills met the trees, a modest single story tucked between wild brush and sloped pasture. It was the kind of place built not to impress, but to hold together in winter. A thin layer of frost glazed the windows, but the porch light had been left on, likely by Clay, who had offered to check on things while Jake was gone. Jake stepped inside and inhaled the faint scent of pine cleaner, dust, and something older his own life, paused and waiting. The next morning, the town square unfurled like a stage, dusted in snow and flanked by folding chairs hastily arranged on salted brick. A temporary podium had been erected in front of the war memorial, where wreaths from previous December still sagged under weight of time and weather. The townspeople gathered in slow, steady waves, neighbors, shopkeepers, retired officers, schoolteachers in quilted jackets, all murmuring in quiet tones. The ceremony had not been publicized, and no regional press had been invited. At Eleanor's request, it was kept small personal. Dignified. Sheriff Lucas Dent arrived in full dress uniform, the sharp lines of his jacket contrasting with the wear around his eyes. He moved with the gravity of someone who had been waiting to speak for too long. When he took the microphone, the crowd hushed, not out of obligation, but anticipation. He didn't read from notes. He didn't need to. He spoke of mistakes, of weather and urgency and the kind of silence that settles too quickly over names unconfirmed. He apologized not only to Jake and Eleanor, but to the town that had buried the wrong man without question. He paused, and then named the one they had lost. Officer Caleb Merritt, a name that hung briefly in the air before settling into hearts. Lucas turned toward the animal at Jake's side. Axel stood again without leash, eyes alert but calm, posture dignified like he understood the formality of the moment. The medal hung on a ribbon of navy and gold, engraved with a single phrase: "For loyalty beyond command." When Lucas bent to secure it to Axel's collar, the crowd held its breath. Axel didn't flinch. The wind moved around them like a pause in song. Nora stood at the far edge of the crowd, her hands buried in her coat pockets, the file from the hospital finally left behind. She wore no makeup, only fatigue and the quiet clarity of someone who had spent too many nights replaying choices. She hadn't come for recognition. She hadn't come to speak. She came because something had to be witnessed. She watched Jake with a knot behind her ribs, part relief, part reverence, part reckoning. She had stood for years beside hospital beds, trusting in systems, in protocol, in documentation stamped and filed and reviewed. But this had shown her the chasm between what is verified and what is true. She carried that weight now, not as shame, but responsibility. Near her stood a child, no more than 8 or 9, with a wool hat pulled low and gloves a size too big. His name was Thomas, called Tommy by the town. He had once been saved by Jake and Axel during a spring flood 2 years back. When the boy heard Jake was alive, he'd begged his mother to take him to the square. He had clutched the news clipping for days, refusing to let go. His voice didn't tremble when he pointed to the stage and whispered, "That's him." It simply remembered. After the speech, the crowd approached in small groups, offering handshakes and short words, some sincere, others unsure what to say to a man returned from the dead. Jake accepted them all with the same quiet courtesy, never stepping more than an arm's reach from Axel. At one point, a local journalist from the county paper, Megan Trent, a sharp-featured woman in her 40s known for writing obituaries with poetic restraint, approached him, notepad ready. Jake offered her a glance and a shake of the head. She understood, closed the pad, and moved on. Nora waited until most had gone before she approached. She stood quietly beside Jake, both of them looking toward the spot where Axel now sat, with the medal glinting faintly beneath his collar. She told him the hospital board had opened a formal review. Dr. Bear was under investigation. Policies were being rewritten. Jake said nothing, but his nod was enough. They stood there in silence, a shared understanding without exchange. Eventually she stepped away. Her breath joined the cold air, and the square thinned until only a few remained. Jake lingered a moment longer, and then Eleanor joined him. They walked away together down the salted path, Axel padding ahead with ears back and tail low. Not weary, not worried, only watching. Winter in Brook Hollow had softened, no longer sharp as a blade but still holding its quiet weight. Snow no longer fell in thick veils, but drifted down in thin, tentative threads ash at the end of an unseen fire. The roads were half melted and streaked with salt, the trees bare and rattling in the breeze. Morning light spilled gently through the curtains of the house, nestled halfway into the woods, a modest place of timber and memory. Here, life was neither loud nor fast. It returned, as breath returns to cold hands slowly, almost reluctantly. Jake Rourke kept a rhythm now, not the old cadence of shift reports and briefings, but one of quiet gestures, waking early, feeding Axel, checking the wooden pen out back even though no one had asked him to. He split kindling that no one needed, wiped down windows already clean. And then came the walks long, circuitous, with no destination. He followed the same woodland paths he'd once trained on, boots brushing dry leaves buried beneath snow's shallow crust. Axel was always there, a silent sentinel at his side. No leash, no spoken commands. Just presence, like a vow without ceremony. Sometimes Jake stopped by the creek, where the ice formed in jagged veins across the surface. It was here, years ago, that Axel had learned to track by scent, nose pressed to frozen bark, eyes bright and hungry to prove himself. Jake would crouch then, hand resting absently on Axel's back, his eyes watching the current that no longer moved. His grip was still firm, but his gaze no longer scanned for threat. It listened to branches creaking, to the hush of snow settling, to a silence that had become companion, not absence. Inside, Eleanor Rourke held to her own rituals. She was a woman of lean posture and quiet insistence. Her silver hair remained in a tight knot even in solitude, and her glasses sat low on her nose when she read. She made tea at the same hour every day, and never forgot to leave the porch light on when Jake stepped out after dusk. She rarely asked questions. Instead, she offered presents the way she slid a bowl of soup across the table without comment, or kept the radio low so he could hear the wind if he wished. Years had taught her that survival was not loud. Nora Bell visited often now, though never on a schedule. Some mornings she brought newspapers folded under her arm. Other days, warm apple pie in a paper box from Callahan's bakery. She never stayed long. Just enough to lean against the doorframe of the kitchen, say hello to Axel, study the photos above the stove. There was one of Jake and Axel taken 3 years ago, both covered in mud, both grinning in their own way. She looked at it more than once, but never said a word about it. Sometimes she left a book behind, sometimes a list of medical contacts. Once she left a pine-scented candle without note. Jake always walked her to the porch, no matter the cold, no matter how short the visit. He didn't say much, but stood beside her in a way that made space between them feel less like silence, more like trust that didn't need explaining. One day, the air sharp but not bitter, Nora asked the only question that had followed her since the ceremony. Her voice didn't rise above conversation, but in the stillness of the living room, it landed like snowfall. Had he gone? Jake didn't answer out loud at first, but his nod was slow, and when she stayed beside him long enough, he spoke few words, measured, but enough. From those quiet pieces, Nora learned what she had wondered. He had gone. Jake didn't answer out loud, but his nod was slow and certain. From his eyes, Nora understood he had attended Caleb Merritt's funeral. Quietly. No badge. No formal salute. He had stood at the very back, blending into the crowd, not wanting to be seen, only to be there. She imagined it then. Jake in a plain coat, boots still creased from the hospital, watching as Caleb's coffin was lowered. She imagined his hands at his sides, empty, save for a small police pin unlabeled, anonymous that he'd placed on the wooden edge before turning away. Jake hadn't needed to tell her the rest. She knew he had remembered the moment clearly. Caleb, young and scared, but still calling him sir, even with blood soaking his vest, not for protocol, but for clarity, for strength. That word had stayed with Jake, a final act of order in chaos. He had left no wreath, no name on any register, just the pin, and the breath he'd held until he was halfway back to the woods. Back in Brook Hollow, the days settled into quiet rotations, the kind where no one called for backup, no sirens, no urgent radio clicks. Just the soft thud of Axel's paws on snow, the metallic clink of spoons against ceramic, and sometimes, rarely, the short phrases exchanged in passing between survivors who didn't need to remind each other what had almost been lost. One evening, as the sun bled orange into the pines and frost etched itself across the kitchen window, Eleanor brought a mug of tea to where Jake sat by the fire. She didn't hand it to him, just placed it on the table and turned away. He murmured something, almost inaudible. She didn't ask him to repeat it. She didn't need to. Brook Hollow remained unchanged to most. But for those who had brushed the edge of silence, the edge where names are lost and returned, each day carried a different gravity. Each morning became a quiet miracle, not dramatic, not glowing, just a breath remembered. And in the shadow of that knowledge, Axel would sometimes lift his head at the wind, bark once into the trees, then settle again beside the door, watching not for threat, but for the shape of peace as it moved slowly, steadily, back into their lives. This story reminds us that loyalty sees what eyes often miss. In our daily lives, we may not hear dramatic barks or uncover hidden truths, but we all have quiet signals, gut feelings, loyal companions, moments that ask us to pause and pay attention. Sometimes love doesn't speak. It waits, watches, and never gives up. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Comment below, has your pet ever done something that made you believe they knew more than you thought? We'd love to hear your story.